Hey everyone, Chris here. Thanks for checking out the podcast. If you're enjoying it and learning something along with us, please consider becoming a supporting patron at patreon.com/ateachershistory. Or you could leave a rating and review on iTunes. It would be a huge help. If you'd like to raise your hand and participate along with us, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, @ateachershistory, or shoot me an email, chris@ateachershistory.com. All right, let's get on to the next episode. Hello, welcome into A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me again today. Did you know that in George Washington's first term as president, Alexander Hamilton, his Secretary of Treasury, came up with such an ambitious financial plan that it began to divide Washington's own cabinet? And that in order to get this plan passed through the House and the Senate, they had to negotiate on the location of a new capital, Washington, D.C. And at the end of Washington's first term, he was ready to step down, and he turned to none other than his right-hand man at the time, James Madison, to write his farewell address for him, which we know was never actually issued. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out, because today we will cover that and a lot more in episode 82, Washington's first term. Hamilton makes his mark. All right, everyone, welcome into episode 82. Today we are going to dive deeper into Washington's first term and the first few years of United States domestic and foreign policy. The book recommendation for this week is Jefferson and Hamilton, The Rivalry That Forged a Nation by John Ferling. I know last week I gave you 3 book recommendations and said I wouldn't be giving another one for another week or two, but I couldn't help myself. And right after I was done recording that episode, I bought this book and read this one, and it was good. It was good, but it was a bit misleading. It was more like a biography of Jefferson with some great stuff about Hamilton thrown in, but I think the title is a little bit misleading. It talks a lot less about their personal rivalry as much as I hoped it would, but a good book nonetheless, and I'll make sure I put it up on the website at teachershistory.com under the book recommendations. That's Jefferson and Hamilton, The Rivalry That Forged a Nation by John Ferling. Today, as you're listening to this, whenever it is you're listening to it, there will be a new episode up on the Patreon page, a bonus episode. And this bonus episode is all about the devolution of the relationship between Alexander Hamilton and his former allies, James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. And I dive much deeper into what made their relationship fall apart and how Madison and Jefferson really plotted together while still working for Washington to totally undermine his political platform and his presidency. This is while Jefferson was serving as Secretary of State in the cabinet. Really incredible stuff. I put a lot of work into this extra Patreon episode, and I think you'll really like it. So if you go to patreon.com/ateachershistory and sign up to support the show, you'll be able to access that Patreon episode. And I will be doing a lot more Patreon episodes in the future for all of our patrons. I know I said that a few months ago, and I threw a few up, and then I actually switched jobs again. So my life became a little crazy, but now I'm settled back in, and I have a lot of stuff I want to put up there. So head over to patreon.com/teachershistory and check it out. Last week, we began to discuss the presidency of George Washington and dove pretty deep into the details in his efforts to create a fair and mutually agreeable solution with the Creek Nation that we know did not really happen in the Treaty of 1790. And I'm glad we were able to dive deeper into this event, not only because it is incredibly interesting and impactful to those involved, but it also gives you a peek into what some of the most basic challenges that Americans had when trying to negotiate with Native Americans and, of course, vice versa. We will, of course, talk much more about the tenuous relationship between the Americans, the white Americans, and the Native Americans in the years moving forward, hopefully providing you with a balanced view of the conflicts and deeper understanding of the events that will unfold. Because what I really want to stress in this podcast, especially when it comes to relationship between Native Americans and African Americans, and then we move into the late 19th century, early 20th century when we talk about European immigration and then Eastern European immigration, Asian immigration, right? There will be a lot of conflict and a lot of tension. And within all of these, I think it's really important to take the perspective of, like, in these relationships, there are no winners and losers, right? There's no point in trying to justify one side or the other just to win an argument or to feel better about ourselves. So I'm going to try to strip all of that emotion away the best I can to just lay it out and look at both sides of the situation and try to empathize with both sides of the situation. So we'll be talking much more about Native Americans in the future, and I look forward to it. So now that we have the failure of the Treaty of New York in the rear view, let's return back to New York City to see how Washington was handling this whole presidency thing and all the other challenges that came with it. When we look closer into the first term of Washington, it seems like his detailed involvement in the attempted treaty with Creek Indians was the exception rather than the rule, because for the most part, Washington viewed his role, something I think I also brought up last week, as a presider over the other men who were elected to run the government. His idea of executive power was a far cry from what we know of today. We will see in the focus of our episode today that when the most heated debate of the young nation breaks out over Alexander Hamilton's plan to create a bank, Washington is happy to abdicate the responsibility of defending it to Hamilton himself. But before we get into that, I want to mention that the first major action taken by this government that George Washington avoided was the Judiciary Act of 1789, which created the court system of the United States. Because, see, under the Constitution, it just said that there would be a Supreme Court. It didn't say how many people would be on the Supreme Court. It didn't detail the circuit court or the district courts, any of that. So that all had to be created, and they basically deferred that responsibility to the first Congress. That way the people were, indirectly, but much more involved in the creation of the court system. And that would have been just another enormous debate at the Constitutional Convention that they probably did not feel like having. So the court system was created, and shortly after this, the debate on slavery reemerged in the House of Representatives in 1790. And one of the things that really pushed it forward was Ben Franklin, in the last year of his life, signing off on the petition to consider emancipation. Franklin, signing this right before he died, gave a certain amount of credibility to the debate. But Washington stayed out of it and more or less relied on Madison to take care of it and to suppress the emotional responses from people and see if they could hold off with that. Because unlike the Constitutional Convention, this was a public debate. So people began to get really worked up over this. And while Washington had expressed disdain for slavery privately in the past and a desire for gradual emancipation, he refused to get involved in the debate. And like I mentioned, empowered Madison to snuff it out in the House, which he did so effectively. So the court system is created. The Faustian bargain to retain slavery is upheld, kicking that can down the road once again. And now it's time to talk about the real fireworks of Washington's first administration. In probably the most problematic abdication of power and responsibility, Washington gave the full responsibility for figuring out the nation's finances to Alexander Hamilton. And I guess in some ways this made sense. As I've mentioned before on this podcast, it's pretty well known that no one's intellect could rival Hamilton's. Just ask him. He'll tell you. And even though Hamilton wasn't known as a numbers geek, Washington figured he could handle it. So, challenge accepted. And after diving headfirst into everything you could possibly want to know about the country's financials, he released a 40,000-word report called A Report on Public Credit. This podcast today is probably 4,500 words. So that should give you an idea of just how many words, handwritten, 40,000 words is. In order to better handle this outrageous debt, At least it seemed like outrageous debt in the late 18th century. Hamilton proposed that all of the debt be consolidated and assumed by the federal government, and a national bank be created to manage it. Doesn't sound so bad, huh? Well, this was an absolutely ground-shaking proposal. By creating this national bank, the federal government would be increasing its power significantly. Its sovereignty would be undeniable, and the states would, in some ways, be indebted to this national government. I mean, this is like textbook Alexander Hamilton. Make an insanely bold plan, announce it publicly, and defend it relentlessly, and know more about it than anyone who wants to argue with you. And throughout the process, make sure you take moments to remind them that you are smarter than they are, and you are right and they are wrong. The bank issue was actually where Madison and Hamilton began to separate themselves politically, with Madison eventually joining Jefferson to create the Republican Party to rival Hamilton. Remember, the relationship between Madison and Hamilton really went all the way back. I mean, for 5 years now, they've been buddies, right? Going back to the Annapolis Convention, Hamilton having a huge influence on Madison, convincing him they needed another convention and a whole new government. And then they worked together to write the Federalist Papers and to get the Constitution ratified. So they had quite a relationship, but this was really the beginning of the end with Madison and Hamilton's relationship, because Madison personally hated the idea of this bank, and Jefferson personally and philosophically hated this idea of the bank. So let's dive into the basic details of Hamilton's full financial plan, because the bank was just one part of it. So part number one. Alexander Hamilton said that the federal government should assume the state war debts. Some states have more debt than others, but this will allow for everyone to be on an even playing field. It would also allow the United States federal government to increase its debt, and then in theory, as it pays it off, it will be able to build more credit internationally. But not only this, the assumption of these debts will make it easier to pay them off and will begin to force national loyalty onto the people, moving it away from loyalty to their state. Number two, in order to help pay off these debts, Hamilton wanted to establish an excise tax on domestic and imported alcohol. This would be a very big problem with some people and lead to the Whiskey Rebellion, which we'll cover in much more detail in episode 83. And then number three, Hamilton wanted to create the aforementioned national bank. Because obviously, Hamilton argued, if you're going to assume state debts and take them on as federal debt, and then you're going to tax people for goods, you will need a bank for this money to all run through. It can't be done without a bank. Hamilton was hoping through his three-pronged plan to establish credit, like I mentioned, provide some financial stability for this young nation, and use the bank to create a common currency, which would be great. Something more stable and valuable than the Continentals that were issued during the war, because to some people, these were almost worthless. As you can imagine, while it all seems to make sense, this proposal made a lot of people really angry. This is such a bold and audacious proposal, it would totally change the makeup of America, financially and politically. The primary issues with this plan were as follows. Number one, once again, just like the creation of the Constitution itself, this by some was seen as a consolidation of power. And it was pretty undeniable. It was definitely a consolidation of power, no explaining this one away. Hamilton would admit to this and basically just reason that there's really no other option. Number two, the second primary frustration was that this consolidation of power would be in the North. New England banks and speculators would profit off of this bank at the expense of the southern and more rural states. Virginia's Governor Beverly Randolph in January of 1791 reacted to this proposal by writing to George Washington, quote, "In an agricultural country like this, therefore, to erect and concentrate and perpetuate a large insured interest is a measure which your memorialists apprehend must, in the course of human events, produce one or other of two evils: the prostration of agriculture at the feet of commerce, or a change in the present form of federal government, fatal to the existence of American liberty." The following clip from the John Adams miniseries on HBO is a great example of the suspicion that the rural South had of this new bank proposal. In this clip, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton are sitting at a table in a cabinet meeting discussing the issue, with Jefferson having just recently returned to America from France. The two men not only bring up the potential concentration of power in the North, but also discuss one of the primary justifications for the bank. Create a debt, and then you will be able to borrow. Without a debt, without a history of paying off debt, you will be limited in your desire and ability to borrow money and expand. And again, if you're a fan of this podcast, I think you would love the miniseries John Adams. It is so good. All right, let's roll the clip.
You must find Philadelphia much changed, Mr. Jefferson.
More change than I could have imagined, Mr. Hamilton. Not the city itself. All cities swallow everything in their weight.
That's no surprise to me. That's why I abhor them. But I've been, as you know, in revolutionary France, where the streets are filled with the songs of liberty and brotherhood and the overthrow of ancient tyrannies of Europe, and to return from there to this, our cradle of revolution, and find the dinner table chatter is all of money and banks and authority is an unwelcome surprise.
Unwelcome, perhaps, but necessary.
I must admit, Mr. Hamilton, I'm a little uncertain as to the purpose of the Treasury Department. No doubt its function will reveal itself to me in good time.
The future prosperity of this nation rests chiefly in trade. Trade depends, among other things, on the willingness of other nations to lend us money.
And how would you propose to establish international credit?
Our first step would be to incur a national debt. The greater the debt, the greater the credit. And to that end, I have recommended to the President that Congress adopt all the debts incurred by the individual states during the war through a national bank. The idea being that if the states owe Congress money, then other nations will feel more inclined to lend it to us.
If the states are indebted to a central authority, it increases the power of the central government.
You have it exactly. The greater the government's responsibility, the greater its authority.
The moneyed interest in this country is all in the North, so the wealth and power would inevitably be concentrated there in the federal government, to the expense of the South.
If that is the case, it is unavoidable if the Union is to be preserved.
I fear our revolution will have been in vain if a Virginia farmer is to be held in hock to a New York stock jobber, who in turn is in hock to a London banker. The opportunities for avarice and corruption would certainly prove irresistible.
Well, there you have it, as I have heard said. If men were angels, then no government would be necessary.
So as you heard, Jefferson and the Southerners had a pretty simple argument. If a national bank is created in a nation where most of the trade and wealth is in the North, naturally more power and influence would grow in the North. And to what end? But to Hamilton, that may have been the reality of the situation, but there was really nothing that could be done about it. It was an unavoidable reality. So we know that the critics of this plan didn't like the consolidation of power and didn't like how they thought it would be in the North, but they have more issues than just that. Their third argument was, if the bank was to be created, the federal government, in assuming all of the debts, would be issuing bonds to creditors. These bonds would be backed by the federal government and help create stability in the market, which sounds good, but they would also tie the loyalty of the wealthy directly to the federal government. And on top of this, and probably one of the most frustrating things to men like Madison, is that these men who were issued these bonds, likely, many of them were speculators who had bought up debt from war veterans for pennies on the dollar. That made Madison and others really annoyed. And their fourth argument, lastly, Madison and his allies would come to learn that this national bank would be controlled not by the government, but mostly by private individuals. about 75 to 80% of the directors in the bank and the funds in the bank will be controlled by private citizens and businesses. This is too much for some of Hamilton's opponents. They are furious. But Hamilton tries to explain to them that the Secretary of Treasury will always know what's going on in the bank. And on top of that, Congress is the body of men that issues the bank. So if they don't like it, they can just pass legislation and get rid of it. But in the face of the criticism of his cabinet member, George Washington stood aside and allowed the debate to play out. But that doesn't mean it didn't affect him. Washington was in fact pretty upset by his home state of Virginia being so openly critical. But in the end, he stayed quiet publicly, and the bank plan passed in Congress. But not right away. And of course, it didn't help Washington that his home state had men such as Edmund Randolph, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and James Monroe, and their arguments were very important, and the ensuing debate has had an indelible impact on our nation. These men argued that the 10th Amendment, the amendment that said every power not listed in the Constitution was reserved to the states, meant that since there was not a federal power in the Constitution for the government to create a national bank, such an action was obviously unconstitutional. And this is where Madison really begins to break with Hamilton, because he's saying, you're basically butchering the document that we wrote. You're abusing the power that it gave the government. And he should know, right? Madison declared, quote, "In reviewing the Constitution, it was not possible to discover in it the power to incorporate a bank." Hamilton, in a response that was over 13,000 words long, what did you expect, proffered an argument that has totally reshaped our interpretation of the Constitution in the United States. Hamilton argued that, look, Madison, there are two different types of powers the federal government has: enumerated powers and implied powers. Hamilton wrote that since Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution said the federal government had the power to, quote, "make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or any department or office thereof." Hamilton said that the understood realities was that there would be things the national government had to do in order to execute the powers explicitly given to it. So in other words, an enumerated power, right, a power explicitly given to the federal government, was the power to tax. Well, Article 1, Section 8 says that the government had the power to, quote, "make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers." So Hamilton said, if the federal government has the power to tax, the Constitution says right here, we can do everything that is necessary and proper to be able to effectively tax. So, how do you do that? I don't know, create a bank that can collect these taxes and then effectively distribute them for whatever means necessary. I mean, this isn't oversimplified, reductionist view of this argument, but this is more or less what he was saying. And, he has a pretty good argument. It does say it right in there. But acceptance of these implied powers at this time, so early in our nation's history, transformed the power of the federal government by drastically increasing its impact. And in case you were wondering, yes, this is something we still argue about in today's politics. A lot. With Hamilton's argument clearly laid out, Washington then had the political cover to do what he likely wanted to do all along: sign the bill and create a national bank. Interestingly enough, the debate over the national bank brings us to a discussion about the location of the federal capital in Washington, D.C. Up to this point, I've mentioned how New York City is the nation's location, the nation's first capital under the Constitution. And you may have wondered when, how, and why all of that changed. Well, the Constitution allowed Congress to choose the site for the nation's capital that could exist outside of a state structure. This issue was brought to the floor and debated, but the representatives just could not agree on a location for the capital. Heck, they proposed 16 different locations. So let's tie these two issues together, Hamilton's financial plan and the creation of Washington, D.C. It's 1790, and Hamilton's plan has been proposed, but met heavy resistance and has not been passed into law. And Alexander Hamilton is sort of freaking out because he is beginning to slowly realize that after all of this work and what he thinks is a pretty ingenious way to empower our nation and get it off on the right foot, it might not actually pass into law. The amount of debt that the Assumption Bill, which is Hamilton's plan, would be taking on from the states would be over $20 million. But most of this debt was from the northern states. That meant that the southern states, like Virginia, would almost be subsidizing the debts of the northern states. And Virginia, by the way, had already paid off half of their debt from the war. But Hamilton and others argued, well, it's not Massachusetts' fault that all of the, so much of the fighting happened there. It's not New York's fault that so much of the fighting happened there. We are all one nation, and we should pay off these war debts together. Because in the end, the war created independence for all of us, even though some fought and experienced many more hardships than others. Madison inserted himself directly into the middle of the debate. He was the one who proudly kept Hamilton's financial plan from passing in the first place, and Madison had also been proposing a location for the new capital right next to his home state of Virginia, along the Potomac River, where present-day Washington, D.C. is today. In what is referred to by historians as the most consequential dinner party in the history of the United States, Thomas Jefferson invited Hamilton and Madison over to his apartment to get them talking. At that dinner, no one is exactly sure what was said, but Hamilton and Madison worked out a deal. Hamilton told Madison that he would whip up enough votes from the Federalist-leaning members of Congress to get the capital city moved to the Potomac River. If Madison would, in turn, whip up enough votes to provide passage of Hamilton's financial plan. While there was a lot more negotiation around these topics than just this one conversation, the idea of such an incredibly important decision could be, having been possibly made over some booze and cigars is still a pretty cool narrative. Hamilton, Jefferson, and Madison all worked together to get the necessary votes, and both the Residence Act, which was the bill that created Washington, D.C., and the Assumption Bill, which was the one that included Hamilton's financial plan, independently passed the House and Senate with very narrow margins. Washington was pumped, and he signed both bills into law. With the location of the new capital settled, Washington and Jefferson got to work, but it wasn't without detractors. Some of the Pennsylvania legislators were not happy. They wanted the capital to stay in Philadelphia. As a side note, in the Residence Act, it said Philadelphia would be the temporary location while they built Washington, D.C. But we know that did not happen. Jefferson recommended to Washington that he should take over the process of creating this new city, because if they gave the power to Congress, they would just mess it all up with their incessant pissing and moaning. And he probably had a point. Washington selected the specific site on the Potomac, adjacent to Georgetown. He then asked Congress to approve an increase in the proposed size of the city, and they did just that, making sure to clarify, though, that this site could only be built on the Maryland side of the Potomac, not the Virginia side. In the spring of 1791, Washington hired an architect for the project, Pierre Charles L'Enfant. Washington approved pretty much all of the plans for building after a few complications, and he really liked this because it gave him the opportunity to check out the progress on his way home to Mount Vernon. One thing that most don't realize, though, is that they planned on paying for many of these Capitol buildings by selling land near the site. But few people were interested in buying it because at this time there was really nothing there. It was just a swamp along the Potomac River. While building this capital city, the government will run into issues with funding the project, and Washington never actually had a chance to live in the city that bears his name. Now that the Assumption Bill is passed, and a bank is created, and the capital city is moved right next to Virginia to allay some of their concerns, let's move on to foreign policy issues that faced the United States and Washington during his first term. Like the project in D.C., Washington had a pretty direct approach to controlling his foreign policy. While this did not really present itself fully until his second term, Washington likely held many of his foreign policy views from the very beginning. Washington was a pragmatist when it came to foreign policy, unlike his Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, who was quite the idealist and Francophile. Francophile means someone who loves France or the French people, just like Anglophile means the same thing towards Britain. Washington both appreciated the French and the help they provided in the war, but wanted to make sure he maintained an impartial approach to dealing with foreign nations. He wanted to keep the interest of the United States front and center at all times, because he believed, and he mentioned it again in his farewell in 1797, that relationships between countries were nothing like relationships between people. While people will make sacrifices for one another and usually reciprocate with each other, Washington held the belief that, for the most part, countries do whatever is in their best interest at the time. Period. With John Jay not wanting the job of Secretary of State and Jefferson not returning from France for the first year of his presidency, Washington played a direct role in foreign policy with his buddy Henry Knox supporting him. He played such a critical role that he continued to have direct communications with Gouverneur Morris, who was his correspondent in France. And this is really important because as the French Revolution began to get going in Paris, beginning in 1789 and lasting about a decade with some heads being chopped off in between, Jefferson felt a sense of kinship with the French. And when he returns to America, would begin to lobby Washington to get involved in some way to support their revolution. From Jefferson's perspective, there was little difference between the motivations and circumstances of the American Revolution and the French Revolution. But not everyone felt this way. And partly because of Washington's communications with Morris, Washington wasn't so convinced. At one point, Gouverneur Morris wrote to Washington that, quote, "The American Revolution had been guided by experience and light, while the French were obsessed with experiment and lightning." Morris was relied upon heavily by Washington, and it helped him create his perspective of the French Revolution. In the end, President Washington and later President Adams will steer clear of getting involved in the French Revolution or supporting the French or the British in their subsequent war against each other. And in the end, Washington's primary goal in his first term was to avoid conflict. He thought the U.S. was too vulnerable for such a crisis, and he did everything he could to remain consistent with that. We'll cover this stuff in a little more detail next episode when we dive into Washington's second term. So as Washington's first term came to an end, he was already tired of being president. Heck, he was tired of being president before he ever even took office. He was proud of himself for staying out of the way pretty effectively, not getting involved in any foreign wars and avoiding all of the most contentious political battles, especially that of economic reform, which he handed off to Hamilton, and that had worked out well enough, because Hamilton basically took a bullet for Washington in public debate. In 1792, Washington was looking forward to his retirement as he had been complaining recently about how tired and unenthused he was by his work schedule. In May of 1792, he asked Madison to draft an address that announced his retirement and informed the nation that he did not want to be included in the 1792 election. But this did not last. As his most trusted advisors, Hamilton, Jefferson, and Madison, Knox, etc., all begged him to stay, Washington was once again reminded of his seeming indispensability to the young nation. What became even more concerning for Washington, though, was the bickering back and forth between Jefferson and Hamilton. In what initially seemed like a typical rivalry between two men who respectfully disagreed with each other, Washington couldn't help but notice that these men had very legitimate enmity toward one another. And ironically, both of these men did hate each other and respected the crap out of Washington. And they both knew that Washington's presence is what protected the United States from the insidious influence from the other one. Jefferson argued Washington needed to stay because if he were to abdicate his position, Hamilton would likely continue to try to exert his control further over the government, especially by leaning on his financial allies in the New England area, who surely would be more powerful after the creation of the National Bank. Without Washington there to keep this bull in a china shop in check, who knows how powerful he could become. Conversely, Hamilton wanted Washington to stay so Washington could contain Jefferson's influence over the government. Hamilton's biggest beef with Jefferson that was while he was part of the cabinet, he felt as though Jefferson was not falling in lockstep with Washington or his platform. And, it was obvious he wasn't. These weren't just like emotional arguments. In fact, Hamilton believed it was embarrassing how attached Jefferson was to the war in France and that Jefferson was threatening America's tenuous position by trying to convince Washington to get involved in a war that they did not need to get involved in. And look, this rivalry wasn't anything new. Jefferson and Hamilton had been at each other's throats for a while now, something I detail pretty clearly in the Patreon bonus episode. Jefferson had openly complained to Washington in the past about Hamilton and how he believed that Hamilton was bad for this country. And looking back on this period in American history, it is evident to most scholars that this rivalry was truly the beginning of the American two-party system. At this point in American history, political parties technically did not exist. But when Jefferson and Hamilton, two of the most recognizable men in the nation, split apart, they began to split American opinion into one direction or the other. And when I say two-party system, I'm not quite referring to the one we have now with conventions, platforms, tickets, etc. This really came about in the Jacksonian era in American history. But make no mistake, Jefferson and Hamilton split put it all in motion. And ironically, Jefferson, or so he claimed, hated political parties. I'm sure he wouldn't be too fond of our retrospective analysis of his efforts today, but when taking the facts into account, it is impossible to deny his role in all of this. And it sort of makes sense. The debates over slavery, the creation of the National Bank, and the Assumption Bill were alarming, especially to those in the South. These issues cannot be understated in just how much of a threat they were to the status quo in states like Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. For men like Jefferson, these actions taken by the national government, with Hamilton as the mastermind, were both prompted with hopes for Northern commerce, or, quote, that speculating phalanx, as Jefferson referred to it, to take over and to drown out the influence of the Southern states. As these events progressed, you can imagine that many Southerners, especially in Virginia, were starting to reconsider just how great of an idea this whole constitutional compromise from 1787 really was. As this entire debate played out, it was James Madison, once again, who inserted himself right in the middle of it. But this time, he and Hamilton had clearly and forever moved in different directions. The federal government that he had worked so hard to create, Madison that is, and defended for years, in his opinion, was going off the rails, so to speak. And he should know, right? I mean, it was his idea to write the thing in the first place. If anyone should be, at least in his mind, an authority on the Constitution, it'd be him. Jefferson joined Madison in his opposition to Hamilton and personally regretted ever compromising with him in the first place. Because remember, Jefferson was the one who gathered the three together at dinner to make the Washington, D.C. Compromise. Jefferson, when reflecting upon his compromise with Hamilton over this Assumption Bill, lamented that, quote, of all the errors of my political life, this has occasioned me the deepest regret. And when I say Jefferson and Madison joined each other in opposition, I'm not kidding or even remotely overstating this. Hamilton had infuriated these guys so much, they began to undermine Washington's administration right in the open. In 1791, Jefferson and Madison traveled up to New England to try to drum up support for their opposition to the Federalist platform. They worked with essayists to put out complaints about the administration, especially Washington's refusal to support the French in their revolution, while Madison wrote essays of his own under a pseudonym. Madison's essays, along with those of the Allies, warned that this new government and its recent actions were eerily reminiscent of the British monarchy they'd just overthrown. Basically, they were arguing that this new government is not carrying out the intentions of the, quote, spirit of 1776. Washington was unhappy with the actions of these two confidants, but he wasn't overly concerned. This was not a monarchy. He was asked to serve his post, and those around him were all either elected or constitutionally appointed. On top of this, you must remember, Washington was America's general in the war. He saw firsthand how much of a disaster this Federalist system and state sovereignty really was when things got tough. As time wore on, it became more and more awkward and confusing that Jefferson was still serving in Washington's cabinet. I mean, he was doing all of this while simultaneously working with Madison to publicly rebuke the administration he was working in, laying the groundwork for the platform that would soon become the Republican, or Democratic Republican, Party. But Jefferson was able to get away with it, because while he was directly involved, he had Madison doing all the dirty work for him. As historian Joseph Ellis puts it, Madison was the general, and Jefferson was the generalissimo. But people took notice of this awkward reality. It was impossible to ignore. Washington's allies were concerned for him and very wary of Jefferson. But like he normally did, Washington wanted none of the drama. He still trusted both of these men and hoped that over time they would begin to understand his perspective. Eventually. But it must have been hard. These men didn't talk about Jefferson and Hamilton. Their obvious agreements went together, but it had to be difficult for Washington to see it all slowly falling apart. You may be wondering, so how did Madison and Jefferson handle this situation? How did they sort of live with themselves, right? How do you spin this one? You work for a guy, respect and admire him, and then behind his back, trash everything he's trying to do, publicly and anonymously. Well, remember when I mentioned that at the end of the Washington first term, he complained about how tired he was and his heart wasn't totally in it, right? I sort of teased that at the beginning of this episode. Well, this is what Jefferson and Madison really jump on and rely on. They spoke about how they believe Washington's influence was steadily waning, and in turn, it was really Hamilton, as the man behind the curtain, taking this government in the wrong direction. This was politically wise because this way they wouldn't have to take on Washington directly in their criticism. And while Jefferson and Madison played on Washington's current mental and physical and psychological state, they were still wholly supportive of him running for another term, right? Which just shows their hypocrisy in all of this. They were terrified, once again, of what Hamilton might do if he didn't. Jefferson once warned Washington that if he did not serve another term, quote, "The North and South will hang together, only if they have you to hang on." As the election of 1792 was on the horizon, Washington was still in denial. He sent out allies to try and find other practical and amenable candidates with no success. He talked about how serving another term wasn't an option for he and Martha because he just wanted to go home and he could not wrap his mind around doing this job for another 4 years. So what happened? Another unanimous election and a pretty dejected President Washington. His second inaugural address was basically one paragraph. That's it. This is what it said. Quote, "I am again called upon by the voice of my country to execute the functions of its chief magistrate. When the occasion proper for it shall arrive, I shall endeavor to express the high sense I entertain of this distinguished honor, and of the confidence which has been reposed in me by the people of United America. Previous to the execution of any official act of the President, the Constitution requires an oath of office. This oath I am now about to take and in your presence, that if it shall be found during my administration of the government, I have been in any instance violated willingly or knowingly the injunctions thereof, I may be subject to the upbraidings of all who are now witness of the present solemn ceremony." How stirring. That was it. The whole thing. As you pack up your things, I'd like you to consider just how enormous of a task this job, the first president of the United States, was for any person, and how seemingly perfect Washington was for the role. The creation of the National Bank was a game changer for this country, with the return compromise of the location of the capital not being close to enough in retrospect to men like Jefferson, Madison, and the other Republicans. Washington was able, at least in his first term, we'll see what happens next week, to keep the nation out of war, help in whatever ways he needed or was not needed, and kept Hamilton and Jefferson from killing one another. Because we all know that responsibility fell to Aaron Burr, Jefferson's political ally turned enemy. Another topic I can't wait to dive deeper into. But we have a lot to cover before then. Next episode is Washington's second term, and we see how he continues to find the delicate balance of doing what's best for the nation in the face of increasing criticism. Head over to patreon.com/ateachershistory to check out my bonus episode where I dive much deeper into the devolution of the relationship between Hamilton, Madison, and Jefferson, the beginnings of the Republican Party, and the plot to undermine Washington's presidency. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed.